Welcome to Charles Dickens' A Brain on Fire, a series that digs deep into the life and works of one of the greatest novelists of all time. The following episode contains accounts of mob violence and state punishment, so listener discretion is advised. Hi everyone. It is a thrill today to welcome the brilliant Professor Ian Haywood of the Centre for Inclusive Humanities at the University of Roehampton. Ian is a specialist in the radical politics and visual culture of the period of 1750 to 1850 and has published extensively on it in books such as Bloody Romanticism, Spectacular Violence and the Politics of Representation, and most recently Queen Caroline and the Power of Caricature in Georgian England, both for Palgrave. And, appropriately for today, The Gordon Riots, Politics, Culture and Insurrection in Late 18th Century Britain, for Cambridge University Press. But, before we invite Ian into the room, here's a little background to what a writer living in the 1840s might refer to as the Riots of 80. Friday, the 2nd of June, 1780. Some 50,000 members of the Protestant Association march in orderly fashion to Parliament. The crowd believe that they are defying the enemies of liberty by opposing the Catholic Relief Act, which is a bill that aims to soften just a little the punitive legal restrictions imposed on British Catholics. Over the next 7 days, the crowd will swing violently from petition to protest to riot before a brutal state retribution forces them back from the brink of revolution. The Relief Act had been prevented from being introduced in Scotland the year before, and this is where the strange mercurial figure of Lord George Gordon steps forward. Dickens, in Barnaby Rudge, describes Gordon as a man accustomed to address the people by placard, speech, and pamphlet, and someone who was looked upon by his colleagues in Parliament as a cracked-brained member of the lower house who attacked all parties and sided with none, and was very little regarded. Gordon's actions that week are as perplexing to Dickens as they are to historians. There are contemporary accounts of him being carried through the streets of London in a mob-drawn carriage as buildings are set on fire. Gordon is seen gesticulating wildly to the rioters, but it is unclear to witnesses whether he is encouraging the mob or trying to stop them. 4 days into the rioting, Gordon seated himself in the chamber of the House of Commons, wearing the blue ribbon of the Protestant Association in his hat. When members on both sides of the House challenged him to remove it, he refused, so it was forcibly torn from him by the MPs sat near him on his own bench. In less than 2 days' time from this petty incident, hundreds of people outside Parliament who are far from the protection of the state will be dead. Reading excerpts from Barnaby Rudge and contemporary newspapers such as the Scots Magazine, the Kentish Gazette, the Northampton Mercury and the Oxford Journal, plus the works of Thomas Holcroft and George Lilly Craik, is the fantastic actress Holly Hales. Ian, hello and welcome to Charles Dickens' A Brain on Fire. It's so brilliant to have you here with us.
Hello, Dominic. I'm very pleased to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Not at all. I've been wanting to do this episode for such a long time, and you're such a busy chap. You've been flat out, I think, the last year. But the Gordon Riots, what an extraordinary event. I'm so thrilled that Dickens wrote about them so that we get to talk about them. For those that don't know about the Gordon Riots, what's the way in? What are the flashpoints in your mind when you think of them?
Well, flashpoints is quite a good description because the image that I have in my mind is of the catastrophic destruction of large parts of central London. In a sense, London on fire. It was such a scale of destruction that hadn't been seen since the Great Fire. It was a conflagration, almost like a kind of divine punishment. It was on that kind of scale, even though it was, of course, named after the leader of the Protestant Association, who was trying to get Parliament to repeal an act that had given certain new rights to Catholics. So it's this great unleashing of sort of violence and destruction against property, though, not against people. There were lots of deaths in the Gordon Riots, but they were all meted out by the military when they eventually stepped in and shot people, basically. So there is a lot of loss of life. But the abiding image of the Gordon Riots is an unleashing of sort of popular violence in the name, at least initially, of Protestant liberties, which were seen as under threat by Catholicism. So, it leaves a bitter taste in the mouth, that, doesn't it, for us now, thinking that this was motivated by religious prejudice. So it gripped London for almost a week. So it was also a very prolonged event. It doesn't just flare up in a day. It occupies London for nearly a week, and it does go through various stages that we can talk about. So I think why people should remember the Gordon Riots is because of the scale of them, the amount of destruction, but then peculiarly, to some extent, they were forgotten until they were revived in Dickens. And most people probably get to the Gordon Riots probably through Barnaby Rudge, isn't it? And those great chapters where he describes the mob rampaging through London, burning buildings.
Just on Barnaby Rudge, which I'm always thrilled to bring up because I love the book so much. It's a bit of a rare one for Dickens, isn't it? But the image of the gin running through the cobbles in place of what would be red wine 9 years later in Paris.
Cities, Paris, yeah.
Are those descriptions from Dickens, are they historically accurate, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, Dickens did his homework.
The gutters of the street and every crack and fissure in the stones ran with scorching spirit, which, being dammed up by busy hands, overflowed the road and pavement and formed a great pool. All round this fearful pond, husbands and wives, fathers and sons, mothers and daughters, women with children in their arms and babies at their breasts, drank until they died.
That description is based on, particularly on a book by Thomas Holcroft. Thomas Holcroft was a liberal and, in fact, a radical later on in the 1790s, but he wrote this alleged eyewitness account, and this description of the gin running through the cobbles and actually catching fire, and then the rioters drinking burning gin and sort of immolating themselves in this orgy of self-destruction. Dickens didn't invent that, and if you look at my book, Bloody Romanticism, which I wrote a few years ago, the final chapter of that book is about what I call the spectacular riots. And what I mean by that is a kind of riot that gets embedded in the popular imagination. And the Gordon Riots is the start of this, which is basically that urban riots become associated with a kind of pathological view of the mob as a kind of life of its own, where things get out of control. It becomes taken over by the lawless, the rabble, the lower classes. The idea that there's some kind of leadership, particularly genteel leadership, that can kind of keep it under control, all that goes. And it becomes this orgy of destruction, which eventually becomes an orgy of self-destruction. And this drinking of burning gin is a kind of poetic justice, isn't it? That's like something out of Dante.
From the burning cellars, where they drank out of hats, pails, buckets, tubs, and shoes, some men were drawn, alive, but all alight from head to foot, who, in their unendurable anguish and suffering, making for anything that had the look of water, rolled, hissing in this hideous lake, and splashed up liquid fire, which lapped in all it met with, as it ran along the surface, and neither spared the living nor the dead.
There's a book that's often been forgotten, but I do mention it in Bloody Romanticism, which is a book published round about the same time Thomas Carlyle wrote The French Revolution, so the mid-1830s. So as Dickens' career is getting going, we know he loved the French Revolution, don't we? He absolutely adored that book by Carlyle. I think he dedicates Tale of Two Cities to it. But there's this other book by a man called George Lilly Craik called Popular Tumults.
As it has been with wars, so it has been with riots. Some of the fiercest and bloodiest which history records have been excited not by the pressure of any real grievance, not by the hope of attaining any tangible advantage, but by mere speculative opinions, right or wrong, which have inflamed men's passions and filled them with hatred and rage against all who did not think in the same way with themselves.
And this book covers a number of riots including the Gordon Riots and the Swing Riots and so on, later riots.
Yeah. And what I'm interested in, two things really, is the fact that it's referred to as the Gordon Riots, plural.
Yeah.
So it's obviously various flare-ups that are linked together over the course of that week.
Yeah.
The legacy of those riots, I mean, could you quite conceivably be a courtier in Paris in 1780, hearing about these horrific riots in London, thinking, oh, good God, this is not the sort of thing that would happen here only 9 years before your own Bastille falls?
You could. I mean, it was in the press. And if you were reading about it in France, there might be two conclusions. One would be this just confirmed your hatred of Britain because it's anti-Catholic riots. You know, that's the kind of the first thing. And the second thing is that the second phase of the riots, hence the plural, where it becomes more kind of proto-revolutionary, I think, yes, indeed, you could see that as an omen, basically, of what might happen in France if the Ancien regime doesn't listen to the calls for reform. You hit your nail on the head, because in 1789, when you get the French Revolution, in some ways, yes, you could argue that the Gordon Riots did it first. And in fact, then, you know, you get the uprising in Paris and you get the burning down of the Bastille, which echoes some of the highlights of the Gordon Riots, particularly the attack on Newgate Prison, is very like a Bastille, you know, an attack on the Bastille. But such, of course, as we know, was the momentousness and the scale of the French Revolution. It actually eclipsed the Gordon Riots and to some extent turned the whole polarity, sort of political polarity of it round, so that that kind of mob anarchic revolutionary violence then became characterized as foreign. You know, we don't do that here.
Yeah.
Whereas in fact, you could argue quite the opposite, and people have argued that in fact we did it first to some extent. We showed how it could be done.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I remember I did an episode with Adam Zamoyski on the French Revolution, and he pointed out that the British went way more conservative during the time of the French Revolution, you know, and looking on in horror. So any instinct that they would have had a decade earlier for uprising just melted away in the face of that. What I thought would be quite fun would be to go back and construct a prologue of the year before the riots, I believe in Edinburgh, where something happened there which enabled, in a sense, London to take place, and maybe the characters involved in that.
You're right insofar as this is where Gordon comes from, of course, Lord George Gordon.
Right.
In that he first came to prominence because he was the leader of the Protestant Association in Scotland that managed to stop the Catholic Relief Act being introduced there by taking, you know, extra parliamentary action, i.e. getting out on the streets, and there was a certain amount of destruction and rioting. Scotland was different from England, remember, because Scotland had its own legal system, you know, had sort of semi-autonomy in that sense. And so the Catholic Relief Act was introduced first in England in 1778. So it was already in place by 1779 when they tried to introduce it into Scotland, which, of course, you know, Scotland being heavily Protestant. I mean, you still have the legacy of the Highlands, of course, but lowland Scotland, Presbyterian, heavily Protestant, they stopped it being introduced by taking militant action, you know, direct action, as we now say. So it was as a result of this success, if that's what we want to call it, in Scotland, in Edinburgh, that Gordon was then invited to become leader of the London Protestant Association, you know, and sort of head up its campaign to try and get the act repealed. They were saying we shouldn't be giving Catholics any more liberties, which is very unpalatable to us now. But the reason they were saying that is because they associated Catholicism primarily with France, i.e. the old enemy. So Protestantism, or papism, as it was sometimes known, was a kind of shorthand for other political regimes that were seen as absolutist, not like democratic Britain, you know, which had the parliament and a monarchy that were relatively well balanced. It wasn't a democracy in our sense, of course. So this idea that the government were kind of playing fast and loose with these fundamental British rights, the freeborn Englishman that goes back to the Reformation. And this government, led by Lord North, was seen as themselves kind of acting tyrannically by riding roughshod over these freeborn liberties of John Bull and the British. But also the resentment against them was exacerbated by the fact that the war with America had been going on for some years. The war with America was not popular, certainly with wide swathes of the public. Depending on your political persuasion, I mean, America was part of Britain, of course, so it's seen as a kind of civil war to some extent, whereby it was all to do with unfair taxation, and the king was seen as siding with highly conservative elements who wouldn't allow America its sort of relative autonomy. So it was seen as a kind of wicked authoritarian thing to be doing, to be fighting our own people, basically, in America. The war was unpopular. It was also going badly, by 1780. It was, I think the writing was on the wall. The French had joined in, the Spanish had joined in, the Dutch had joined in.
Okay.
So things were getting pretty worrying, really, that Britain's empire or proto-empire might be under threat. So what lay behind the Catholic Relief Act? At least at one level, it wasn't just this liberal act to free Catholics from discriminations. It was to allow more soldiers into the army, because when you joined the army, you had to swear allegiance to the king, who was head of the Church of England, the Protestant religion. And if you're a Catholic and you weren't prepared to swear that oath, you couldn't join the army. So they basically relaxed that requirement. And this was seen as a rather disreputable deal by objectors who also didn't like the fact the war was going on. So they were saying that you're prepared to do this dirty deed with Catholics as the only way you can keep the war going, this unpopular war. And in 1779, a man called Admiral Keppel, was court-martialed because he'd lost a naval battle. And this was seen as very unfair by a lot of the British public. And his trial created some riots. It was a bit of a powder keg, I think you could say, as you approach the summer of 1780.
Yeah. I can see that. So there are conditions, perfect conditions laid there for rioting to break out, and then whichever cause happens to be the one at the moment. And no popery is a pretty catchy slogan, isn't it?
No popery is indeed, and it's all there through Barnaby Rudge, isn't it?
Yeah.
No popery, no wooden shoes. Gordon wouldn't like his name attached to these riots, because he certainly didn't, as far as we can see, didn't intend there to be riots, because the way that you tried to persuade Parliament in those days to listen to you, to change its mind, to act according to public opinion, was to present a petition, literally present a petition to Parliament. Petitioning was one of these long-held civil liberties. It was part and parcel of the British Constitution. And the petition, which had your grievance or your demand, could be accompanied with signatures from people who supported it. So this goes back to the 17th century. It keeps going into the Chartist period, which is the period Dickens Riots Barnaby Rudge, of course, which is really about Chartism, I would argue, Barnaby Rudge. And the more signatures, the more you could say we've got public opinion on our side. There's three elements. There's petition itself, there's the signatures that are backing that up, and then there's the way in which you present it, where you were allowed to assemble a crowd and march to Parliament with the petition, with the signatures. Do you see what I mean? So it's this great kind of symbolic ritual, and it's all about numbers to some extent. So Gordon's Protestant Association assembled something like 45,000 people. It's quite a lot of people to march to Parliament with this huge petition, like a huge sort of roll, on the back of the cart.
So did they have to sew the bits of parchment together and pass it around the country, that sort of thing?
They did indeed. And then the only way you could really keep it together was to roll it up, literally to like a huge bale.
In the morning of Friday, June 2nd, a great number of persons with blue cockades in their hats met in St George's Fields. A tailor was employed to tack together the different skins which had been signed by the petitioners, composing a very large roll. They separated into 4 divisions: the London, the Westminster, the Suffolk, and the Scotch. With the last there was a Highlander in his country dress, his swords drawn and followed by a pair of bagpipes. Lord George Gordon joined them about 11.
None of these original huge petitions survive, as far as I know. Certainly the Gordon one doesn't, but someone copied most of the names. So we do have a record of who signed up to the petition, but we don't have the petition itself. I don't know what they did. Maybe they burned it, whatever. So you have this huge crowd, 40,000 people. It was like the Ark of the Covenant or something. If you look at the engraving of it, it looks very kind of religious, this procession. And they marched to Parliament, all very orderly. It was only when they got to Parliament, which didn't look like it looks now. I mean, the old Parliament was a bit of a warren, a bit more congested around the key chambers. And it was only then, it's like, well, we've arrived. Now what happens?
In the House of Commons, Lord George Gordon came several times to the top of the gallery and harangued the mob. He told them to be decent and orderly, at the same time to keep to their purpose, to insist on answer to the petition that night, for that Monday would be the King's birthday, and probably the Parliament might be prorogued on Tuesday, and then there would be an end of the affair. Meantime, the chaplain of the house told Lord George that all the fatal consequences that might happen that night would lie entirely at his lordship's door. Another member accosted him thus. "My Lord George, do you intend to bring your rascally adherents to the House of Commons? If you do, the first man of them that enters, I will plunge my sword, not into his, but into your body." This dismayed Lord George not a little.
I'm not quite sure what Gordon had in mind, because he went into Parliament and started putting his case for the repeal. He presented the petition and then started putting his case. And the people outside got very angry when it became apparent that Parliament didn't want anything to do with this. And
Right.
Gordon kept reporting back to the crowd. Now, there's some accounts suggest he was then whipping them up. There are other accounts saying that he didn't. He was trying to be kind of as even-handed as he could. But suddenly the crowd then started getting rested, and there was some intimidation of people arriving, depending on who they were. The crowd did seem to know which lords seemed to be in favour of and which lords were against, through heckling them, basically, also to jostling them.
The mob became disorderly, treating the members with the greatest insolence and barbarity. Lord President Bathurst was pushed about in the rudest manner and kicked violently on the legs. Lord Mansfield's wig was pulled off and dashed in his face. Lord Stormont had water spouted in his face.
This went on for a while, and then there was no kind of leadership. There was no obvious control. And when Gordon emerged and said they've rejected the petition, they're going to have another look on Tuesday. So like in 5 days' time, we're going to debate it again. That's when the crowd got very angry. It was also approaching darkness. It was getting towards the evening when, for whatever reason, that's always more threatening, isn't it, when things get dark. That's when the rioting started. Splinter groups went off in various directions and started attacking, ransacking, burning down buildings, sites, houses associated either directly with the Catholic Relief Act, who had introduced it, who had sponsored it. This comes back to Lord Mansfield, who was seen as someone who'd been in favour of it. Or chapels, or churches, I guess we'd have to say.
A fifth, desperate and infernal gang went to the elegant house of Lord Mansfield in Bloomsbury Square, which they, with the most unrelenting fury, set fire to and consumed. The loss here was immense. A most valuable collection of pictures, some of the scarcest manuscripts said to be in the possession of any private person in the world, were all sacrificed by madmen and villains. And Lord and Lady Mansfield were, with difficulty, preserved from their rage by making their escape through a back door, a few minutes before these miscreants broke in and took possession of the house.
There were limited rights of worship for Catholics by this time. It wasn't completely that it was prohibited. Yes, Catholics were discriminated against. You couldn't be in public office. You couldn't be an MP, you couldn't be a magistrate, you couldn't be a civil servant, but you could do some worshipping in some places, and you could also worship in private. So there were a number of chapels in London that were actually, it was legitimate to worship there. One was in what's now Lincoln's Inn Fields, the Bavarian embassy, and there was one in what's now Golden Square. It was Golden Square then in Soho, which was the Sardinian embassy. Those churches were attacked and they were set on fire, and their crowd went inside and basically ransacked the place, pulled out furniture, altarpieces, works of art, and started this ritualistic violence of basically making bonfires. So they would burn the building, and then they would get what was inside the buildings out into the street and set them on fire. So you have two lots of fires going. You see that you have the building and the possessions, if you like. And it's a very interesting, isn't it, kind of symbolic thing going on there to give the crowd this sense of power. And this was very disciplined. And what I mean by that is they didn't burn down other buildings. They didn't just set whole streets on fire. And they would even let firefighters come along and put out fires either side, but they wouldn't let them put out the fire of the building that they targeted. And that's in all the reports. So you get the beginning of this terror, and the terror is definitely in the reactions you get, not just in the press, but, you know, individuals who later on write their letters and memoirs and so on, some of whom are very well known. Poets like William Cooper, people like this, who are very dramatic and vivid. And Cooper says it was like a nation in ruins. It was a metropolis on fire and a nation in ruins. At the same time, you get these press reports showing that, in fact, certainly at this stage, the destruction, there was an element of discipline about it. Whether that makes it, for us, better or worse is another matter, isn't it?
No, but it is interesting, isn't it, how it isn't indiscriminate. And as far as we can possibly tell, the protesters themselves, the mob, didn't actually kill anyone. They didn't lynch Catholics that they knew in the streets or anything.
They didn't.
Which is very interesting, is it, when it seems such an uncontrollable, burning gin-soaked kind of orgy that actually...
Which is why I think, to some extent, Dominic, it's the second phase that has tended to characterise, if you like, because it gets more spectacular, you know, as it goes on.
So where are we? We're over the weekend then. Have we got to Monday?
We're getting over the weekend. So you'd had some... It was already pretty spectacular. I mean, when you read responses like Mansfield's house and other big houses, you know, with important people being burned down, you know, that causes a huge conflagration. But I think it's also the symbolism of it, that these are people of power and influence, part of the ruling class, if you like, and their residences have been attacked and burned down. I mean, riots were not uncommon, and to some extent the authorities would allow it to happen as long as it didn't get too much out of hand. They'd allow a certain amount of disturbance and then they might give way slightly. It was almost like a bargaining, way of, it wasn't trade unions doing it, it's kind of a sort of street power. But what did the state have at its disposal? Well, it had the Riot Act, which had been around since 1714, and the Riot Act was designed to disperse crowds.
Our sovereign lord, the king, chargeth and commandeth all persons being assembled immediately to disperse themselves and peaceably depart to their habitations or to their lawful business upon the pains contained in the act made in the first year of King George I for preventing tumults and riotous assemblies. God save the king!
When you read the Riot Act, if you don't disperse within an hour, you can be shot. You can be arrested, but if you were killed during your arrest, it's your fault. There's no penalty on the soldiers who are going to, whoever's going to arrest you. So the Riot Act was read in these early stages, but it didn't seem to have much effect, partly because no one stepped in then, or there was some arrests made, but not on the scale you'd think. Okay, so as things started to escalate over that first weekend and the crowd became more confident in their power, they actually went to some jails and started releasing the prisoners who've been arrested for this rioting. Do you see what I mean? So they were releasing their own comrades and colleagues. And this reaches its pinnacle in the second week. And it's building up to the Tuesday when the issue is going to be debated again in Parliament. And I think Parliament got this wrong, because had they given some concessions here, maybe the thing would have died down. But basically they just booted it out again on the following Tuesday. And at this point, the thing erupts into a whole new phase. So what you get then is destruction on a whole new scale, and it's not now limited to Catholic targets, but certainly, you said earlier, the flashpoints. The one that goes down most in the popular memory, and it's one that Dickens focused on, and it's there in the visual representations that you get, is the attack on Newgate Prison. Because Newgate Prison is seen as the ultimate symbol of the authority or power of the state, you could argue. And it was a new building. It had only been built about 10 years earlier. It was a vast, imposing, it's kind of Palladian. You had sculptures of chains on there as well, manacles. And there were some prisoners in there who'd been arrested for rioting, but it went way beyond that. So on the Tuesday after this rejection, the crowd attacked Newgate. They forced the prison keeper to give them the keys. They released all the prisoners. Dickens describes this. It's absolutely fantastic how Dickens describes all these prisoners. Some of them don't even know what's going on. And some of them are condemned. They're going to be hanged. They can't believe that they're on the outside again.
About 6 o'clock, different parties filed off in detachments and directed their march to Newgate, where they appeared in the most formidable numbers and immediately demanded the release of the 4 prisoners taken in the Sardian ambassador's chapel and the man for taking goods from Warwick Street Chapel last Friday. This demand was necessarily refused, and a most resolute attack was immediately made. Mr. Ackerman's house was forced, the greatest part of his furniture brought out, which was piled against the principal gate of the prison and set fire to. But, as its massy substance was plated with iron and sluiced with water from within, the fire did not communicate. Mr. Ackerman's house soon after appeared in flames, which reached the chapel in a few minutes, and it was evident that the whole prison would soon be involved in the general conflagration.
The reason why the attack on Newgate became the most potent symbol of the Gordon Riots is because it was the kind of pinnacle of crowd power. They released prisoners, they burned all these accoutrements to do with state power, and they basically turned it into a carnival. So if you look at these engravings, they're dancing, they're celebrating, there's scenes of family members being reunited, prisoners being reunited with their families, there's pickpockets, there's a couple of black rioters who historians are very interested in because there were a couple of black rioters put on trial. So it's this carnivalesque celebration of crowd power. That, I think, is the absolute pinnacle, and Dickens said, didn't he? He said, I feel quite smoky when I'm writing this scene, because he admitted that he was absolutely loving it at the same time as he knew it was a kind of orgy of destruction. He said he kind of got infected with the power of it himself. He said, I can't help it. So that was the Tuesday. But on the Wednesday, you could argue it gets even more spectacular and more revolutionary because there's an attack on the Bank of England.
It is hardly possible to collect, in one point of view, the havoc of this night. The mob made 2 attempts upon the bank, but were so much intimidated by the strength with which they beheld it guarded that their attacks were but feebly conducted. They were led on to the first by a brewer's servant on horseback, who had decorated his horse with the chains of Newgate, but were repulsed at the first fire from the military, and their second succeeded no better. Several of them fell in these skirmishes, and many more were wounded, as the importance of these places made it necessary to show but little lenity.
The attack on the Bank of England is not the scene that either writers or artists chose to represent. And one reason for that could be that it potentially was much more revolutionary than the attack on Newgate. There was also this attack on Langdale's distillery, which is in Holborn, in central London. And that's where you get the scene of all the caskets of gin and unrefined spirits. So I guess they were actually poisonous. The crowd broke in, brought all these caskets up, emptied them, and that's where you get this image of this kind of orgy of self-destruction. So that was Langdale's distillery. That went up in flames. So you've got 3 huge targets, but it's Newgate that's the one that's sort of picked out for special attention. I think that's why. I think it's the pinnacle of crowd power.
Yeah. And by this point, it really has moved on from just anti-Catholic sentiment then, hasn't it? It's unrecognisable from what it was on Friday.
There were also attacks on toll booths, on bridges, because toll booths, again, we forget that these days. We're just across the river. You had to pay a small tax, a halfpenny or a penny or something. William Blake talked famously about the chartered streets, in his poem London. I walked through every chartered street. Well, one aspect of that was paying a toll. And this would really resent it. So, the toll booths were attacked. And again, you could say that's a sort of target of popular grievance.
The toll gates at Blackfriars appear to have been burnt for the sake of the plunder. There were some lives lost there too, and one man who was shot ran 30 or 40 yards before he dropped, as appears by the blood which may be traced in plashes on the pavement.
So I think it was partly the scale of it, but partly the fact that it now seemed kind of proto-revolutionary, especially attacking the Bank of England. This potentially destroys the whole economic authority of the state. And without the bullion, the metal, the gold currency, you can't provide credits. If you can't provide credits, the whole system is going to collapse, isn't it? Including the wars, because wars were fought largely on credit. That's when the king stepped in.
Whereas a great number of disorderly persons have assembled themselves together in a riotous and tumultuous manner, it is become absolutely necessary to use the most effectual means to quiet such disturbances, to preserve the lives and properties of individuals, and to restore the peace of the country. We have therefore issued the most direct and effectual orders to all our officers, by an immediate exertion of their utmost force to repress the same, of which all persons are to take notice.
There was some suspicion that because the authorities had not been strong enough, in their response to this, there was an element of collusion, because certainly the City of London authority was very liberal, we'd say, very sort of on the left. And therefore, was against the Tory government of Lord North. So it's almost like they were allowing the mob to commit this destruction.
Destabilise North's administration kind of thing.
Exactly, basically. But then that backfired, you could argue, because he then steps in and basically imposes martial law. I mean, Britain was very reluctant to ever use the army directly against citizens. I mean, it would if it had to, but it was very reluctant to do it. It preferred the civil administration to read the Riot Act and so on. And martial law was seen as a foreign, rather despotic thing to do. It's what you did in tyrannical countries. From their point of view, things had got out of hand. They'd already got the troops in London, thousands of them. They were in Hyde Park in tents, but they hadn't been used. And then the king stepped in and said, I'm overruling civil law, civil power, and he authorised the troops to go in and fire at will, basically. So on that Wednesday night, there was carnage, really. We think that the casualty figures might run as high as 700.
Wow.
I think officially it was 300 killed, but estimates could be towards the 1,000 mark. Basically, the troops were just going around and shooting any groups of people they could see. That's how it seems. So that's when it ended, the day after, because there'd been so much retribution. And then you had the trials after that.
It's very interesting. I'm wondering, in that aftermath, when the violence stops, there's a very, very funny passage in Barnaby Rudge, which you might remember, I'm sort of paraphrasing, where a lot of citizens went out patrolling the streets with a big swagger about them because they essentially knew the danger was over and there was no threat.
In Suffolk, no fewer than 3,000 of the inhabitants formed themselves into a watch and patrolled the streets every hour. And, it being the manner of peaceful men to be very bold when the danger is over, they were abundantly fierce and daring, not scrupling to question the stoutest passenger with great severity, and carrying it with a very high hand over all errand boys, servant girls, and prentices.
Dickens gets this right, I think, that once there's been this kind of orgy of violence where wholly unsuitable people come to the fore and in his case, the character Barnaby Rudge, who's sort of mentally challenged, gets kind of swept up into the leadership of this. And I use the Greek term aristeia, which is from Greek epics. It's the moment where the hero is commanding centre stage, usually in combat, that you get the common person, to some extent, the lower class person, thrust into the historical limelight, but for the wrong reasons, and their destiny is to end up in the gallows. Whether they're well-meaning but deluded, or whether they're just nasty, selfish, out for themselves, whether they're wicked, it doesn't really matter to some extent. Once the narrative of the riot reaches its pinnacle and then it becomes this kind of auto-destruction, a kind of purging has gone on, then the terror of the state steps in.
All this day, numbers of gentlemen, with the military, were employed in pulling the blue cockades from the habits of every person they met. It was now as unsafe to be seen with these emblems of rebellion as it was unsafe, during some of the preceding days, to be seen without them.
Order is restored, but we have to remember that the Georgian state had very, very draconian punishments for offences against property. England may have looked rather complacently at so-called despotic regimes abroad, where you could get arrested, political arrests, and letters of cachet in France and so on. But we had the so-called bloody penal code, where the number of capital offences, which were all to do with property, there were scores of them, everything from poaching to stealing a handkerchief. If you were found guilty, you could be hanged. Now, you weren't always hanged. You were sometimes transported, which isn't a very nice fate either, to America, and then, of course, having lost America, to Australia, which is where Magwitch comes in, of course, in Great Expectation. He's an example of that. So the terror of the state steps in at this point, and there's really very little you can do about it, except try to petition for clemency. Of the hundreds of rioters arrested and put on trial, around about 60 were convicted and sentenced to death. But of those, 25 were executed.
On Saturday, at the session at St Margaret's Hill, Lord Loughborough passed sentence of death on 20 prisoners. His lordship addressed them as follows. Prisoners, you have been indicted for several criminal offences, in assembling riotously to pull down and set fire to divers dwelling houses. You have been tried by a jury full of compassion, who have omitted nothing to your advantage. You are therefore the just objects of severity of the law, the protection of which you have forfeited. Among the number of unhappy persons who now stand before me, there possibly may be some whose cases are less criminal than others. Yet as you are all under circumstances of guilt, let me entreat you not to flatter yourselves that any of you will be saved. The necessity of public justice requires that you should be made examples of.
Why were they executed? Because they hadn't killed anyone. They hadn't even, as far as we know, really attacked anyone. It was all about offences against property. That is what went on. And
sorry to cut in, Ian, but what was the social standing of those 25? Because obviously Lord Gordon wasn't executed for his part in it, was he? But
he wasn't, although Gordon, of course, was going to be the most high profile. He was put on trial for high treason initially, and you could still, if you were convicted of high treason, be hanged, drawn and quartered. So in theory, that could have happened to Gordon, but as you just said, the case against him was dropped. I think the evidence was suspect, lacked credibility in various ways. So he got off. But of those 25 who were executed, and they were executed near to the place where their offence, i.e. the attack on a house or some kind of property, took place, we know because of the trials, of course, what they did, what their occupations were. And this absolutely disputes this notion of a mob made up of criminals, vagabonds, people who sort of had everything to gain, if you know what I mean, from this, sort of nothing to lose. We have a wheelwright, a sailor, a bookbinder, a basket maker, a cabinet maker, a pencil maker, a sailor, an ostler, an innkeeper. We have a domestic servant. This is by no means the lumpen proletariat, is it?
The prisoners were brought out of the new jail near St George's Church a little before 10 o'clock. The gallows was fixed near the King's Bench walls, on the side of the fields near the main road. After being tied up, the Reverend Mr Dyer attended them for some length of time. Prayers being over, they took an affectionate leave of him, and 35 minutes past 10, they were launched into eternity, amidst an innumerable number of spectators.
But what's shocking, though, very shocking when you read, again to modern sensibilities, is that at least three of the people executed were teenagers. They were only 17, but that didn't get them off at this time. Elizabeth Collins was a domestic servant, and we know that it's hard to know quite what she did. There was obviously some evidence against them, but she was totally bewildered by the whole thing and was in floods of tears, as she went to the gallows.
Elizabeth Collins, who was about 17 years of age, very penitent, but in the greatest distress of mind, fearful of eternity, though frequently comforted by Mr Dyer, who attended them. After the handkerchief was tied over her face, she begged the executioner to take it off, and let her look around once more, which could not be granted. But when she was turned off, she pulled it up herself, and exhibited her face distorted in the agonies of death, which, being immediately perceived by a sheriff's officer on horseback, he pulled it over her face again. Her mother attended in a coach for her body, and behaved as one actually distracted.
I think there was some sympathy. This was seen as excessive, even though it was the law. And I think if you go back to Barnaby Rudge, you'll see the same thing. Dickens basically says something like, they didn't know what they were doing, really, and now they became the hapless victims of a terrible penal system, which was going to grind them into dust, basically, and exact the ultimate punishment. Edmund Burke was one of the people who supported the Catholic Relief Act, so in some ways was the enemy to the rioters, but he was absolutely against this scale of execution. He said, yes, you can execute the ringleaders. I think he was going to say maybe 5 or 6. That's legitimate because they were directing some of this. But these poor people who were just kind of swept up in it and who might have stolen something, it's hardly on a scale to justify what he saw as martial law, basically. So I include that in what I call the spectacular riot. It's absolutely what you said in your question, that when the bloodletting is over, there's a kind of sympathy then, sensibility kicks in. Now we can feel sorry for these people, but obviously we don't feel sorry for them when they're burning our houses down. But it did expose, and it does now, and it's still shocking, I think, when you read that list, that Britain did have this bloody penal code, and it doesn't really get changed until Dickens's time. Dickens starts writing in the 1830s, and by that point, I think capital punishment was only for murder. All the laws against property offences, I think all that had gone by the 1830s. Of course, Dickens himself then campaigned against public executions, didn't he?
As a parting question, the story of what happens to Gordon then when he's arrested and he's put on trial, there's an interesting twist in the tale of his change from being a Protestant, isn't there? Would you be able to tell us a little bit about what happens to this strange man who caused so much chaos?
So later on, Gordon converts to Judaism. He becomes a kind of honorary, I suppose, which is interesting because his name, which is attached to the riots, is a name associated with religious prejudice. And then he adopts one of the religions which is most discriminated against. It's worth saying, actually, because the Jews don't get emancipated till 1853, later even than Catholics.
Yeah.
And then for some kind of, in the post-French Revolution years, because of some insult he made against Marie Antoinette, as far as I know, he ends up in Newgate. He ends up dying in Newgate. The ironies abound, don't they, in his story?
Mm.
So the idea that he was some sort of crazed fanatic and bigot who led a mob through the streets of London isn't really credible when you look at, you look at the historical evidence.
Mm.
And once the riots started, he did absolutely everything he could really to calm it down, and apparently at considerable risk to his own life.
Ian, thank you so much. This has been wonderful to talk to you. Thank you. Bye for now.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to Charles Dickens' A Brain on Fire. If you're enjoying these episodes and would like to make a small donation towards the costs of producing them, please follow the link at the bottom of the description and you can make a donation there. Every coffee you buy makes a huge difference. Thank you ever so much, and see you next time.